All right, guys, thanks so much for listening to another episode of the CXChronicles Podcast. Super excited, guys. We have Deon Nicholas joining us today. Deon, why don't you say hello to the CX Nation, my friend?
Absolutely. Hello, CX Nation. Thanks for having me, Adrian.
100%. So, guys, Deon's got a super cool story that he's going to share with us today. Deon's the CEO of Forethought, and this is a super cool customer experience AI company that is doing a whole bunch of fun things in our space. And Deon, you've got a bunch of listeners today who love this stuff, man. Just like me and you, man. They're thinking about customer experience, customer success. They're thinking about retention. They're thinking about upselling, cross-selling. So you came to the right place, my friend.
Absolutely. Looking forward to it.
Why don't you start off like we start off all the episodes, Deon? Take a couple minutes, man. Tell us your story. How did you get into this space? How did you kind of get stuck into the world of customer experience and customer success? And then definitely, how did you come up with this idea of Forethought, man? And how did you put together that building team that's doing this incredible work that the Forethought team is doing today?
Yes, sir. So I was born and raised in Toronto, inner city Toronto, low income family. I was at a young age, I learned to code, and coding became this passion of mine and the thing that I always followed throughout the rest of my life. My first ever job in high school was in customer service. I was stocking shelves at Shoppers Drug Mart, which is the Canadian CVS.
Nice.
For folks who don't know, answering customer calls, answering customer questions on the floor. And even at that time, I always kind of had this realization that I don't always have all the answers to my customer questions, and customers don't always have all the information they need to get their problem solved or to figure out things about, whether it was the pharmacy or the products, right? And so over my life, I'd always thought about how can technology and coding, which is something that I started learning about and loving, be used to help people get their most important questions answered. Eventually went off and became a software engineer. Moved out I live in Silicon Valley now in Millbrae, California. And
a little bit warmer than Toronto, Deon, huh?
A little bit warmer. Exactly. We don't have the Jurassic Park when it comes to NBA finals, but we've got the Warriors.
I like it, man. I like it. And congrats, by the way, huge win this week.
Thank you. Yeah. I don't know if I can, as a Toronto native, I don't know if I can say that I'm technically a Bay Area person now. We'll see, but absolutely great win. And so I built products and infrastructure at companies like Facebook, Dropbox, Palantir. But every single time when I was ramping up on new projects, I realized that, again, I don't always have all the information I need. And it's either buried across or scattered across data silos or trapped in people's heads.
Yep.
And so I kept coming back to this idea of how can AI really help people get their most important questions answered. Eventually started Forethought. We launched in 2018 at TechCrunch Disrupt,
Awesome.
which was super exciting. Really on this mission to use human-centered AI to transform the customer service experience and beyond. So that's kind of how that came about.
I love it, man. So number one, super cool background, super cool story. Before we even dive into the pillars, man, what were some of the things you just mentioned? Some pretty incredible companies, right? Like when you're looking at companies like Facebook, and you're looking at companies like Palantir and Dropbox, there must have been some really incredible things that you started to see early on, or that you were finding early on, that kind of started jumping out at you. What were some of those big items? What were some of the big things that you were looking?
Absolutely. So some of the big things that I've seen, well, one, in every case, it takes technological innovation, thinking outside the box on taking new technology and bringing that to people. And then the second thing that I've always seen in all of these companies that end up being successful is a focus on a hyper focus on bringing on the right talent very early on, and just really focusing on people, whether that's in engineering or in product or in sales or in customer experience. At the end of the day, it ends up being all about people and building the right kind of culture to enable those people to thrive.
I love that, man. I'm glad that you bring that up, because even for an awesome product leader like you, people, at the end of the day, guys, people are the ones that make these decisions. People are the ones that use these tools. People are the ones that figure out whether or not a solution or a set of solutions does or does not work. So I love that. That's super cool. Why don't we dive into Forethought, man? I'm pumped to kind of get into the weeds in this. Why don't you take a couple of minutes, Deon? Give us a sense for how you've gone about building the Forethought team. What are some of the different teams or roles or departments that are really kind of building some of the solutions and building some of the products that you guys are putting to market today?
Absolutely. So at Forethought, we build what we like to call human-centered AI. So AI that's embedded into the customer service experience and really brings intelligence across the entire life cycle of the support inquiry. A lot of people, when they think about artificial intelligence, the first thing they think about is deflecting customers. And we
Yep.
actually like to think beyond that. One, can you solve customers' problems in a self-service fashion? If you can't, how do you make sure it gets to the right human in the right channel at the right time? Because oftentimes human agents are, again, the most important part of the stack. And so we will triage, route, tag, categorize, classify issues, think about sentiment, send it to the right agent, and then we will assist those agents with the problems by providing suggested answers, search resources, and so on. And so these are actually distinct products and modules. And so you can kind of see on our website, Solve, Triage, Assist, and we're launching some other products as well. But again, it really does follow that life cycle of the customer service inquiry. In terms of the teams and how we think about it, we really actually started with just a single product, a single module, and then we've grown that product over time into becoming this human-centered AI platform. And so doubling down on product teams, engineering, we have an amazing machine learning and research team from places like Apple, Columbia, Google, Facebook, so on. And then not only do we think about the technology and the research, but as I said, it's about bringing that technology to the people. So many folks who work with the Forethought team rave about our customer success team. And so we've actually kind of built customer experience into the way that we do business, right? And so it's kind of one of our values in putting customers first. And so definitely a lot of great forethinkers, as we call ourselves, a lot of great forethinkers doing a lot of great work in order to bring our solutions to the market.
I love that, man. I think, as many of our listeners probably are thinking right now, one part of incredible customer experience, customer success, customer support, client services, it's managing inbound inquiries, it's managing inbound issues, it's managing different requests, different feature sets, all these different things. And for the longest time, man, there's been so many different software companies that focused on the mechanics of ticketing, right? You've got some of the OGs like Zendesk and Freshworks and now even up and comers like Customer. There's all these tools that have been built around how to actually tee up a ticket, document the case, add a bunch of information, maybe tag some visibility. But what I love about what you and the Forethought team are doing, and this idea of like the Forethought viewers, you're looking on the horizon for people. It took a while, man, to get companies like Forethought to come along to say, wait a minute, there's a tremendous amount of gold in a lot of these tickets. There's a ton of information. There's a tremendous amount of data. Let's think about how we can help humans with prioritization, severity definitions. Also, I'm thinking, man, from our conversation the other day, even just like helping people see a couple steps ahead when there might be an actual item that's a leading indicator for churn or a leading indicator for disruption or a leading indicator for some customer or some point of contact, maybe feeling a little bit of consternation with your product or your service or your team. So love that you guys knew that was a big space. I think the other big thing is this, man, Deon, it's like as so many different companies grow and as they scale and as they get bigger and as their customer bases get more complex, any help that you can get keeping track of all this stuff is like, doors are wide open, man. Come on in and help us, because as many of our listeners know, this stuff is hard. It's hard triaging on it. It's really hard keeping track of it. And any type of additional technology or AI-based support is going to be super, super wanted and needed in today's world.
Absolutely. I love how you put that. And so one of the things you talked about is this kind of shift in migration from, I would say, over the 2010s. The big shift was the movement to the cloud and the building of these systems of record in kind of SaaS in cloud. You can think of businesses like Salesforce or even Dropbox or wherever. These were all businesses that took the system of record into the cloud. And now what we're seeing is, with the rise of artificial intelligence, you're starting to see the rise of the system of intelligence.
Yep.
Right. So how do you take all that information that's coming from the CRM and then use that to empower and power up your business, whether that's in the customer support or customer experience world, sales, IT service management, beyond? We're starting to see a big wave of not just, okay, how do we bring things to SaaS, to the cloud, but how do we make everything more intelligent?
I love that. And honestly, that's the name of the game. We're living in in a world, and we're living in a marketplace today where customers have super lofty expectations, and they should. Some of the companies that you're naming, we've had some incredible world-changing businesses in front of us over the last 10 years. So consumers, both on the B2B and the B2C side, they've got a wildly different set of expectations for how delivery happens, how we're able to remediate things, even just the time, right? Deon, people want stuff now. Like Amazon, we could thank Mr. Bezos and Amazon for that, but people want stuff now, regardless if it's a cloud-based solution, whether it's a Willy or where, or it's a physical, tangible product in the world. That's just what people expect, man. So I love it. Deon, I'd love to jump into the second CX pillar of tools. Let me break this up into two parts for you. Number one, I want you to definitely continue to kind of give our listeners some ideas for some of the amazing things that the Forethought tool can do. But as you were building the business, as you were building your team, and certainly as you were building like that early customer portfolio, right? When you're getting a bunch of really cool companies to come on board and you're trying to figure out how you could help them, what were some of the tools that you guys had to use, or what were some of the leading technology solutions that you and your team were really kind of leveraging to allow that growth to happen and to allow some of that scale to come into play?
Absolutely. It's pretty interesting and kind of humbling in many senses that a lot of SaaS business is about kind of like just figuring it out.
Yeah.
Right. And so
Yeah.
a lot of my friends who ask like, hey, Deon, like, how would I come up with a startup idea? A lot of times I'll tell them, go and work for a SaaS startup right now and pick any department, and you're
Yeah.
probably going to find the tech stack is completely broken there.
Totally.
And you could probably start a $1 billion business around
Yep.
it. Right. And so
Yep.
and I hadn't realized that until I started the company, right? But even down to so some of our tools kind of like internally, when I think about being a CEO, like in the early days, it was Gusto and Brex and little things to manage payroll and finances and expenses, and then eventually you start thinking about scaling your team, right? And actually a lot of it is actually about scaling your team, planning, managing, and stuff like that. So those are some of the tools I remember we used. But then you start getting more sophisticated around your go-to-market, around your product, right? I actually probably product first, right? So you start leveraging tools. Today we use things like Amplitude in order to get analytics, Tableau across the board. And then on the go-to-market side, obviously, we talked a little bit about Salesforce, systems of record, stuff like that, and then outreach. So, I mean, I could go on and on, but it's just interesting when you think about like building a world-class company. Every single area of the business kind of has that tech stack, and also that kind of that evolution and that growth. And I actually think there's lots of billion-dollar businesses waiting to be born even today. And then on the Forethought side, obviously, as we've already mentioned, we started by thinking about human first, right? So we started with our Assist product, and then over time we actually scaled that, and we said, okay, well, how do we make sure tickets get to the right agent at the right time? So then we launched our triage product. And it was actually in 2020, in response to the pandemic, when we started to see a ton of companies that were seeing a ton of support volume, right? So imagine how many flights had to get canceled, how many people were asking questions of their banks or asking about PPP loans. That saw a spike in support volume. And at the same time, because of work from home orders and the whole pandemic, we saw a drop in productivity as people were shifting and adapting to working from home and this new digital landscape. And so we actually launched our Solve product at the basically the peak of the pandemic in order to help with a lot of these problems. And so it's been interesting to see our own platform, our own tech stack evolve, and it's starting to become, the de facto standard in customer support, automation, and AI. And so that's been a really humbling experience as well.
Deon, I'm glad you brought up the Solve part, man, because I think this is an important one. Like, many of our listeners, they're leading CX and CS efforts at a bunch of awesome, up and coming companies that will be tomorrow's, future business leaders, right? But when you talk about the solving piece and you talk about how to help those folks with leveraging some of the existing data sets that they've already gotten, or to your point, a lot of these companies, especially, let's call it what it is, guys, a lot of these venture capital backed startup growth companies, they don't necessarily always build in a singular type of view where everybody can see everything. As you mentioned, once you start getting to the point where you start bringing on heads of marketing, heads of CX, heads of sales and revenue, it's very common for people to have their specific tools or their specific data sets, or they build inside of their silos. One of the things I love about what you just mentioned about the Forethought Solve feature, though, is like, it's wild, Deon, how long it can take certain really intelligent companies and intelligent leadership teams to leverage that data, leverage your past mistakes, man, more than anything. Like, think about it. Like, some of these companies that have thousands or tens of thousands of tickets, and no one's ever done a review in terms of like some of the gold that's sitting there waiting to get brought back to product, or waiting to get brought back to sales and marketing, or waiting for even for the success side, right? Just making sure that people feel really, really comfortable answering the top 5 things that most customers are going to ask you anyway. That must have been a game changer for the business, but it must have also helped a lot of the early customers that you guys were working with at Forethought. Must have really helped them to see the value, or the time to value, for a tool like Forethought much quicker, much easier, right in front of your face. What was that kind of like in the beginning, with when you really started having some of your first examples of like, guys, we're showing you what the value is, we're showing you how we're changing your business, and we're showing you how we're a strategic partner in your own growth plan? What was that period like for you guys?
Yeah, so we're in a really interesting market, because we're in this market where there was a wave of legacy technologies, chatbots, and things like that all use the moniker AI,
Yeah,
right?
yeah, 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 yeah.
And we all know that your classical chatbots are not AI. They're rules based, they're decision tree based. You literally hard code, if I see the word refund, go and issue a refund. But when the customer says, hey, my package wasn't delivered, I just want my money back, you don't see that refund keyword anywhere. The bot's going to be like, I don't know.
Yeah, 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 yeah. A little confusing.
And we get that confusion, that frustration. And so we were actually in a market where the value proposition was not new and was not unknown. So we didn't have to educate the market on that. Everyone knew that they needed automation. They needed to leverage their technology, their data. But
Yep.
we were in a market where people didn't know how.
Yep.
Everything they had tried in the past didn't work, because it wasn't actually real AI. I like to say, in artificial intelligence, those are a lot more artificial than intelligent, right?
Yeah.
And so being able to deliver value and show our value prop, it actually really boiled down to saying what you mean and doing what you say, right? So actually being able to say, here's the ROI we think we can give you, and then going and hitting that and exceeding that. And that was really what we had to do to build that credibility with our customers. Just in the early days, don't overpromise. Here's the product, here's what we can do, leverage your data, and here are some actual questions that you're seeing answered by the system. And then over time, that really grew. And so we've been able to leverage a lot of that data and turn that into insights, right? Turn that into answers for customers, and turn that into resources for agents. And now we've kind of built that credibility where customers, they're starting to know, like, I am not going to run a scaling support org without something like this.
100%. Yep. It's become almost a major part of every CX and CS leader's arsenal. The other thing too is, you just mentioned the scale part, Deon, right? It's like, if you want to know one of the easiest ways that you're going to be able to sort of ease your scaling pains or your scaling woes, you're going to have to leverage the right types of tools and the right types of technology to be able to get you to that next stage. So I love that you're calling that out, and some awesome points here. Deon, I'd love to pick your brain a little bit on the third CX pillar of process, man. And I'm growing to enjoy this one, because I think the whole world, all of us know, last 3 years, man, with the movement, with just everybody getting shoved into this new remote work management and hybrid work management type of world, which is awesome. I think many of us are happy. I know a lot of us are still happy to get back to, and that's fantastic. But that's also the beauty of the hybrid world, is that people are going to have different working styles and different working preferences, just like our customers, right? Just like every single customer has got a different set of styles. I'd love to hear how you and your team at Forethought has thought about process, especially as you've grown. Because I think the one thing that I'm starting to hear more and more and more with some of our awesome guests in the show is like, every business has a totally different evolutionary path towards how they manage process, how they build playbooks, how do they keep playbooks up to date, or how do they keep them living and breathing so that they're constantly being updated, and it's like the realest, freshest version of your FAQs or your knowledge base or your standard operating procedures. But I'd love for you to spend a couple of minutes kind of how have you and the team at Forethought sort of tackled the evolution of those playbooks, and how have you kind of wrangled, because this is a complex world, man, and you guys have a lot of different types of customers. So I imagine managing and wrangling process for you guys was a bit of an interesting feat. But I'd love to hear what some of the things that you guys did to manage that.
Absolutely. So the interesting thing about process is that process is sometimes a catch-all term, because there's, I would argue, 3 like mini parts to this process loop. One is culture, right? Oftentimes process is put into place because you're actually trying to enforce a culture.
Yeah.
And so the actual better way to do that, and quite frankly, no process is going to work until you do the following, which is embed it into your behaviors,
Yep.
right? And so the first thing you got to be thinking about, what is the behaviors or the patterns of behavior that we want to see in this function? It can be about how you interact with your team and your employees and so on. It can be about how you interact with your customers. It can be about standard operating procedures for, how you sell or whatever. Any part of the business is going to have the culture that you're trying to create or the behaviors that you're trying to see replicated. And I think it actually starts by doing those things. Even before you think about what is the process, you think about what are the things that I got to do regularly
Yep.
in order to get that done. Then step two is, I would say, documentation, right? And so one of the things, and the biggest missing steps, and we definitely went through this throughout all of our growing pains, is not writing it down. And so I can think about when I think about company culture, and like as we scaled from about 20 forethinkers to over 100 forethinkers in about a year's time span throughout the pandemic. One of the things I realized was, hey, if we want to figure out what are the processes that we're going to need and what's the culture we want to build, we got to start writing it down. What are the values, the operating principles? What are the things that we actually do want to see? And literally making that explicit and teaching people,
Yeah.
and then repeating. And so it was like this process of, what is the culture you want to build? What is the process? Or what is the documentation? And then the third is, I would actually argue, and this is probably good for any scaling business, invest in ops. Whatever ops means, every single function has a version of that ops. So when you think about you're building out your sales team, what is your sales ops team or your revenue ops team looking like? As you're thinking about building out your product, what is your product ops team? And oftentimes it's not, a giant 10 or 15 person team. It could be one person.
Definitely.
And maybe it's one person across many different fields. But if you don't have somebody who's monitoring the process, improving the process, and then building out the tools necessary, you're actually going to find that oftentimes that process goes by the wayside.
Definitely.
And so that's when those are probably the ways I would say you can leverage and start investing in building out your process.
I love it, Deon. Awesome points there, man. I think the first one about just this idea of like almost like this culture-led idea around process curation, process optimization, and process ownership. Brilliant, man. Definitely the first time I've heard a guest say it that way, because I think you're right. If you're not working in an environment or an organization or an ecosystem where the actual culture drives the importance and drives why it's so critical and so imperative, that then enter your second part here, why you're documenting, telling the story, recording the story on a regular basis. I think the other thing too, for folks like us and for most of the listeners on the show, especially when you're a growth focused company, guys, when like you've just figured out how to go to market, you've just wrangled up your first 100 or 1,000 customers, like you've just figured out how to go from 24 thinkers to 104 thinkers, like more than ever, your ability to capture, curate, and refine incredible content, right? Whether it's written, whether it's audio, whether it's video based. And by the way, this is another thing, man, Deon, that you're making me think about. And I love that you bring this up, is like, guys, your culture can embed all those different things. So if you're not a writing culture and you're a video culture, awesome. Use a Loom or a Vidyard or a Zoom and make sure that all of your primary storytellers or primary thinkers or your executive thinkers are telling their stories with video. If you're a writing culture,
Exactly.
awesome. Have a bunch of shared docs where you're everybody's adding to the story, co-authoring some of these processes, co-authoring some of these steps. And then audio. Selfishly for me being a podcast guy, Deon, you can imagine I push a lot of our clients at CXC to make sure that they're using the power of your voice, man, the power of your audio messages, audio notes. So many of us this day and age we're on our computer screens and we're out of our pocket on mobile so often that audio has become so easy for us, right? Podcasts, audiobooks, music, all these different ways so you can kind of multitask. But I love that idea, man. I think it's really important. One last question before we jump off our process. During your time building Forethought, did you guys have to knight like a handful of owners? Or I know it's a part of the culture, and obviously you got better at the documentation part, but was there people that own this? Was it leadership team's job to own it? Who did you guys sort of nominate as the guy or the gal that was really going to own some of these different steps that we're talking about right here?
Yeah, great question. And I've been thinking about this and reflecting on this lately, just as I've grown as a leader. One of the things that I'm seeing great leaders, great companies do at any point in time, if you don't have a directly responsible individual or an accountable individual, one person, can't be two, can't be three, exactly one person for any one thing, it's not going to happen.
Yep.
And it's weird because it happens by osmosis. No, this just doesn't happen. So usually what that means is actually two things. One, narrow the scope is kind of the quote that I've heard a lot, which means don't try and do 10 different things, but what is the one, two, maybe three things
Maybe
that you
3.
need,
Yep.
maybe
Yep.
three that you need to get done. Ideally, it's one, right? And so that's what you need to do. And then similarly, have exactly one person responsible for that. That should be their OKR, or their objective and key result. That should be what they're compensated on. If you do bonuses,
Yep.
things like that. And it's kind of, that's how things are built, one step at a time. Things are built by people. And so if you have multiple people in charge of it, you're never going to do it. And that's not to say you need like an entire person owning everything, but on anything, there definitely needs to be that one person owning that thing.
Yep. I think that's huge, man. I think so many of us have heard this idea of like using it, whether it's a RACI model or whether some type of accountability model, but like even understanding the responsible party versus who's simply being informed versus who's being consulted, or who needs to just be aware that the thing is even happening in the first place. But you're right, man. Having that delegation point, or that owner, or that responsible party, oftentimes it can smooth a lot of the downstream consternation right there, both internally and externally. So I love that. Awesome ideas there, Deon. Deon, I'd love to jump into the fourth CX pillar of feedback, man. And this one I want to spend a little extra time on, because I was excited just as a CX nerd myself to chat with you about this today. But like, a big part of what your tool does, a big part of what Forethought does, it's unearthing and understanding feedback. But then the other big part of it, it's what you just mentioned a couple of minutes ago, helping to push action, drive action. Like we talk about this constantly in the show, but there's so many tools out there that do the collection part. They can help a company or help a group of thinkers collect feedback. There's not enough tools like Forethought where they're helping to drive action, or give you some type of advantage around which actions to maybe prioritize, or which actions to start with. So let's break this into two parts. I'd love for you to spend a couple minutes talking about how you and the team of Forethought had really kind of gone about collecting, leveraging, and acting upon your customer feedback. And then I'd love to hear you talk for a minute or two about how you've been able to do the same thing with your team as the Forethought team has grown, and how you guys leverage some of your employee feedback.
Absolutely. I'm going to start with maybe a broader variant of that possibly covers both, but more of a philosophy of, there's this book by Daniel Kahneman. Daniel Kahneman is this Nobel Prize winning economist. He writes a lot about how the brain works. And the book is called Thinking Fast and Slow. It's one of my favorite books on decision making. And it talks about basically how people can make snap judgments. That's your fast thinking processes. And it's usually driven by or built on intuition. And then at the same time, and there's like a lot of anecdotes around how that can go wrong and when that can go well. And then there's your brain also has slow thinking. That's when you actually stop and you're like, I'm not going to make a quick judgment. I'm going to process something and then work through and come to a decision. And you often come to very different decisions. Slow thinking is more accurate, but it just takes a longer time. And like 90% of the decisions you need to make, you can actually make with snap judgments. And one of the things they talk about in that book is that the only thing that can make your fast thinking better and more accurate is expertise, is spending time training your intuition. And they give this example, like a firefighter, when they enter a house, they can immediately know where the fire is, right? And so the reason that comes to mind is I think that's actually the core of why feedback is so important, because every single day we're making snap decisions, snap judgments that we're going to be wrong about a lot. But we need to be able to train our intuition. And you do that through looking at the data every single day, right? So pulling in dashboards, pulling in whether it's customer feedback, having some kind of literal visual way to map out that data will train your intuition. And then you use qualitative feedback, survey your customers, talk to your customers, spend a lot of time, do ride-alongs. We did a lot of that in the very early days of building our product to get you that slow thinking feedback, right? So that you can kind of ponder and understand what's going on. And those two feedback loops, data, quantitative, qualitative, that can kind of feed that, okay, I need to make a snap judgment versus I need to dive deeper. It's actually how I think about problem solving in general. And I think it applies in both cases. And that's the kind of thing that we would like to build, and we're trying to build at Forethought for our team, is being able to create these feedback loops so that we can make these decisions but still move rapidly.
I love that, man. So first of all, I just love this notion in general of like your quick thinking and then your deep thoughts, right? Exactly. The other thing too is I'm just thinking that hearing you give us that example, it makes me think about so many different times in my own career where there was times where you could literally tell certain executives were almost purposely doing the slow thought or the deep thought, because to do a rapid thought in a situation like that, there could be risk, or you could potentially cause some disruption in not a good type of way that we normally use that type of term. But other than fast thinking, I'm thinking about some of the busiest, craziest CX or call center teams that I've ever seen in my career. And some of those leaders' ability to do almost like where the 20% of the things that are happening 80% of the times, they build that fast thinking, intuition, almost reactive type of state, which is typically what helps to push along growth or push along the ease of scale. Or again, even just being able to create economies of scale with the team or with a call center team or with a set of tools to be able to do that. So love that idea. One other thing I want to ask you is some questions on though with the ride along. Deon, you might have just made a call out here in the feedback part of the show that I think every one of our listeners, if you're not doing your form of a ride along, you need to be doing it right now. When did you guys start doing ride-alongs? Was it primarily in the very beginning when you were iterating on the beginning of the Forethought tool? Was it when you had already found that product market fit and you already had a handful of customers? When did you really start leveraging the power of the ride-along? Because I think totally agree. That's one of my favorite parts of being a part of the CX or CS team is like, this is where you can build relationships with customers and users, and you can get like intimate awareness or feedback, or not just like what NPS and CSAT and customer effort score surveys give you, but like you can get just absolute gold from your users. What time did you guys start introducing that into the evolution of the Forethought growth?
Day zero, actually. Yeah. So when my co-founder and I started building out the initial Forethought product, the first thing we had to do was figure out whether there was some technological risk. So we had to build out some models and see if there was even something we could build that could understand the data like we needed it to. And so we spent a few months doing that. But the moment we were convinced that the technology could work, we immediately switched to spending as much time as humanly possible with the customers. And we like to say we just stopped writing code.
Nice.
You know what I mean? And so spend time with our customers, because it wasn't going to matter unless we had, early pilot customers. It wasn't going to matter unless we had design partners in there with us. And so we just spent time literally scouring our network, trying to find support leaders who would talk to us and not pitching them a product. We actually had a demo of our AI. It was like a little command line prompt, so that they could see kind of the ideas behind it. But beyond that, we just sat with the directors. We asked to sit with their agents, see how they're working, not even with our tool or anything like that, but just in their day-to-day systems. And then as we started building more, we would ship products and then ask for feedback, do the little ride-alongs or the Zoom sessions or whatever. And as we got bigger, so one, I would actually attribute that to being one of the cores to that early success in finding product market fit.
Yeah.
And then as we got bigger, I would argue this is again one of those cultural things where it actually gets a lot harder to eat your nutrients, your vegetables, right? And so that's something every single person needs to be doing. But at the same time, as you get bigger as an organization, inertia kind of pushes you away from doing what you need to be doing. So that goes back to that process, that culture. How do we build a culture where everyone is talking to customers, where everyone is putting customers first, so to speak? And it's easier said than done, but it's one of those things where you have to build a culture and build a process around.
I love it, man. I absolutely think that's such sound wisdom. And I think, again, for our listeners, come up with your own form of a ride along today, right this second. You're probably already doing some form of it. So awesome to the folks that are, and you better be. But I'm saying for folks that aren't, there's so many people out there, Deon. Think about so many startup founders, so many startup CX and CS executives are constantly thinking about, how am I going to drum up more feedback? How am I going to create more meaningful data to dump into a VOC report? How am I going to figure out how to manage up to the executive leadership team the next 100 pieces of... Start with ride-alongs, because again, it's like, number one, you'll figure out how to get better at some of the qualitative counting, measurement, and management by having those conversations. And then number two, to Deon's point, what takes the cake is when you have the quantitative and the qualitative together. You've got some of the data, some of the numbers, some of the measurement, but then you have stories. And some of those stories are literally where you can get super smart people across the room, across the aisle, across the entire business to start agreeing upon some of the things that are absolutely mandatory to create, phenomenal customer experience and customer success. So I love that, Dean. Those are awesome ideas. Before we wrap up today's show, my friend, I want to make sure spend a couple minutes talking about some of the anything that you want to call out that you and the Forethought team are working on, any upcoming events, anything like that. And then certainly, where can people find out more about you, sir, and where can people find out more about your team?
Absolutely. So if you want to learn more about Forethought, go to www.forethought.ai. I'm available on all of the socials, so LinkedIn, Twitter, all the above. I am at Dojiboy9, DOJIBOY9. Don't ask about my Twitter handle.
I was just going to say, is there a story behind that?
There is a story. There is a story. I can give you the story.
Let's get the story on that, man.
Oh my gosh. I'm going to change my Twitter handle one day, and this is going to never happen again. But when I was a kid, so I mentioned I learned to code at a young age, reasonably young, and I was super into Pokemon and Digimon, and I had this idea that I was going to make a video game, and I was going to call it Dojimon.
Dojimon, I like it.
Yeah, it was like this great idea. Just combined it anyway. That phrase doji kind of stuck with me. It doesn't mean anything now, but it kind of has symbolized, and any like idea I had when I was a kid, like I had these other video game ideas and stuff like that, and that's how I learned to code, was through figuring out how to make video games. And anyway, so that word kind of symbolizes for me learning how to code, that whole journey and that whole experience. And so I've kind of kept it. It's kind of been this silly thing, and it's one of those, like, you make your Twitter handle when you're like, I don't know, however old I was, and I've just never changed it.
So, yeah, I understand, man. I understand
anyway,
that goes.
That's the story. That's the story behind my Twitter handle.
I love it. Well, look, Deon, number one, huge thank you for you coming on the CX Chronicles podcast and sharing your story. Love the things that you and the team are doing at Forethought. Our absolute pleasure, man. And we're going to look forward to seeing what you and the team do next.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me, Adrian. Cheers.